About half a year ago, Kojima Productions released their first game independent of Konami. Finally free from the long-running Metal Gear Solid series, studio lead Hideo Kojima found himself in an exciting position where he could create something completely new for the first time in ages. The result was a polarizing blend of quirky ideas and serious subject matters, all with that distinct Kojima flavor. No matter what you ultimately felt about that game, we can all agree that it was an interesting hot subject for a while. The sheer amount of in-game content and thematic direction meant that this was something people could talk about for hours on end. Quite literally so. There's just so many ideas and subject matters to touch on. The depiction of our contemporary fragmented society, the isolation and loss of community that a lot of people feel in the post-internet world, is a poignant theme. Today we can contact basically anyone from anywhere at any time, and while that is great, we still feel more disconnected from each other than ever before. The internet makes endless interactions possible, yes, but at the same time, we are proven to be just as capable of locking ourselves in a bubble and becoming surrounded by harmful ideas and ideologies. This is the problem that Death Stranding attempts to portray within its narrative. Throughout the game, we find ourselves reconnecting people to the metaphorical network in order to make America, so to say, whole again. Yet we never actually see any remarkable change to how the people in the world of Death Stranding interact with each other or with us as players. For the most part, everyone stays isolated in their homes, only ever communicating via holograms. In this sense, they may be connected through the network, but to us, they are just as distant as they were before. We cannot really feel their presence, and it later becomes strikingly clear that the promise of the network being our savior is simply not true. It is only by the end of the game, when Sam finally decides to disconnect himself from the network by taking off the device that is depicted as literal handcuffs, that he can be free and capable of breaking down the barriers that stood in his way from forming real connections with other people again. This is rather beautifully portrayed in the final short scene of the game, where Sam and Louise's hands finally meet for the very first time. The point of Lou being referred to as Louise in this final scene is not just meant to be some sort of gender reveal, but rather a straightforward representation of how breaking the barrier between them was the only way for them to truly connect on a deeper, more intimate level. They can finally see each other for who they truly are. They are free. All this manages to say so much with practically no words, which sadly is in stark contrast to how most things are conveyed throughout the rest of the game. Because while Death Stranding admittedly does have some strong and clear themes, quite a few of them feel underdeveloped, forced, or at the very least, like they get lost somewhere in the messy story itself. Muddled in wordy monologues and heavy-handed exposition. Even when there is much to take in during the game's runtime, there is so much story offloaded at the very end that it becomes ridiculous even for Kojima standards. The finale is so thick and dense with stuff happening that you might not even realize that this whale is actually the final boss. In a way, you could say that Death Stranding is actually trying to say so much that it pretty much ends up saying nothing at all. It is obtuse while somehow managing to simultaneously be too on the nose for its own good.
I brought you a metaphor.
The absolute overabundance of themes and the over 50-hour story going haywire makes for a quite frankly poor blend. As the title suggests, it's a complete hodgepodge of death and communication, which equally focuses on the death of communication as well as the rebirth of it. And then there's ghosts and the idea of bodies, handling bodies, babies. There's a baby, it sees dead people. You use the medium baby to carry parcels with your very pronounced body away from ghosts and to the living, so you make a strand. And also, you're stranded on a beach. Sometimes it rains. Rain is bad, that's where the ghosts are. The rain ages you. It's a metaphor for the passing of time and and how it's really hard to protect yourself from. That's very important for Death Postman internet delivery. There's a ghost baby too, several ghost babies, eat the bug, drink the monster, World War II, baby, abortion, baby, internet, United States of America, come back, and Conan O'Brien. Somewhere in the middle of this jumbled mess of world-building narrative, symbolism, metaphors, and themes, we found something in particular about Death Stranding that is kind of weird. Not weird in how most people found it to be weird, because it made no sense to them. No, when we say weird, we're talking weird about women weird. In our last video about Kojima Productions and their catalog of games, we looked at titles with somewhat underwhelming female representation. Women being made to pose for the audience on command and flaunting themselves for their enjoyment without repercussions. Death Stranding does, on the other hand, strive away from the sexualization and objectification that was presented in previous games produced under the studio name. And while it is absolutely more subtle, there is still a lot to desire. At this point we have moved away from tangible and easily seen objectification to more underlying problems that might fly under the radar for some. On the one hand, we seem to have strong and capable female characters, but on the other, Death Stranding manages to make the female-coded body and its biological functions into an ultimately defining trait for a large portion of the cast. One of the central themes of the main characters of Death Stranding are problems associated with and revolving around their own bodies, the view of them and the functions of them. Sam suffers from aphantasmophobia, an irrational fear and a deep feeling of discomfort from being touched. Hartman stops his own heart every 21 minutes and is clinically dead for 3 more before it is restarted again. And Deadman's body is made out of 70% cadavers, while the remaining was grown from stem cells, which in practice means that he doesn't have an afterlife within the fictional universe of the game. They all face these problems in different ways throughout the game, but share in common the feeling of disconnect from their own bodies, as well as other people around them. This works well with the overarching themes of alienation and communication. In much the same way, the leading women have to tackle the feeling of bodily disconnect in some major ways. But unlike the men of Death Stranding though, the women and their bodily problems are directly connected to the fact that they are women, charting that good old view of men as the default norm, neutral, and women being an attribute in itself. Fragile is forced to run a delivery without clothes during timefall, losing her youthful beauty in the process, and is then treated like damaged goods because of it. This rather literal molestation of her body is the driving force fueling her wish for revenge, which she is of course only given through Sam's actions rather than her own. Then we have Mama, who is, you guessed it, a mother whose very identity as such informs her entire character from beginning to end when she dies because she aborts her ghost baby. Contained to a single room for the entirety of her life on screen, she mostly acts as a key to get to the next part of the narrative. It's honestly kind of fucked up how obsessively the game focuses on the idea of stillborns and ghosts. There is just little grace or tact to it. Considering this is one of the most difficult things a person can go through, it's straight up tasteless to have Kojima burst in like a clown with an air horn, pushing its ghost lore on it.
Did you like it?
Likewise, the game is honestly weirdly obsessed with cis women and their ability, and even inability, to conceive children in general. Mama is unable to produce eggs, while her twin sister's uterus is unable to carry children. And Bridget is in much the same way unable to carry children. While not all of these are necessarily important plot points, they are integral to their characters, and we are in turn explicitly made aware of it. Now admittedly, this is most likely some form of commentary about the steadily declining birth rates in Kojima's home country, but it does make for some questionable characterization when the female cast in question seem to be women first and characters second. Especially when the problems related to conceiving children are not extended to the male characters even for a moment. If nothing else, the reason these issues are brought up at all seems somewhat superfluous, considering that according to one of the many lore dumps the game hands you, the declining birth rates in the world of Death Stranding is not related to this at all, but rather suggested to be caused by widespread asexuality in the wake of the apocalypse. Which is one hell of a hot take, you have to admit, one that absolutely misrepresents how ace people actually work. But all that pales in comparison to what we would consider to be the most baffling concept of the entire game. The baby units that are used by Bridget's operatives in order for them to sense the so-called beached things are connected to what the game refers to as still mothers. It is revealed that these still mothers are brain-dead women that are being kept alive and sustained in Capital Knot City, never to be seen by the player of course, or really questioned much by the story itself. So basically, BB units are unborn babies taken from women who are kept in a vegetative state, and it is this that makes BBs a sort of bridge between the dead and the living. The ethics of stealing babies from these mothers is lightly touched upon, but it never goes anywhere near the rather disturbing implications of it. More energy, but not nearly enough, mind you, is placed on the babies themselves, their humanity in contrast to their nature as literal tools for the operatives, and in extension, the player. The still mothers are likewise just tools in the grand scheme of things, but their humanity is never really talked about to the same extent. There is quite frankly just not that much information conveyed about these women for the story itself. It is mostly just mentioned in passing, while other exposition is treated as much more important. They seem to only be there to serve as a science fiction explanation for how something with more weight to the story actually functions within the world. This could have been an interesting ethical dilemma, a dark philosophical and thought-provoking idea that makes us question our own morality. But as we said before, it just never really comes to that. They stay irrelevant, and in fact, we would contend that the game treats the impact of still mothers as narratively equivalent to the scribbles on a napkin. And if the short page on the Death Stranding wiki is anything to go by, we're absolutely correct. Even when it is later revealed that Sam himself was a pickle jar baby, and as such had a still mother of his own, it never becomes very important at all. Who Sam's mother, Lisa Unger, was, or any other characterization for that matter, takes a back seat to the much more prominent Cliff Unger, Sam's father, played by Mads Mikkelsen. While Cliff gets a tragic story arc about guilt and regret, and serves as one of the main threats throughout most of the game, the only thing we ever get to know about Lisa Unger is that she was a mother and a wife. That is basically it. It is quite clear that she is here specifically to be killed by her husband so he can progress his story and have ghostly Vietnam flashbacks with his son in the future. Great! And when the concept of the still mothers, a bunch of brain-dead women somewhere, doesn't even become important when it is directly connected to the main character, we can only conclude that it just wasn't thought through as much as it should have been. It might just be that the game is simply too tone deaf to grasp anything on a level other than the dramatic. This may be most apparent during a rather horrific scene with Mama. After a terrorist attack on the hospital she is staying at awaiting a C-section, she gets trapped under the rubble of the building for several days. Here, she's forced to deliver her baby and not surprisingly has a miscarriage right there in the dirt while waiting to be rescued. Now being connected to her new ghost baby, she has to live in the building where this all happened. She even has a window overlooking the scenic vista of the rubble where she was stuck. As a constant reminder, you know.
Who wouldn't want that?
I know, right? The game doesn't seem too interested in talking about this emotional experience in any meaningful way, and it was clearly only done for shock value. This woman is suffering one of the most traumatic experiences imaginable. It is horrific and dramatic. And that is all it was meant to be. And don't get us wrong here, art is of course meant to elicit emotions on a deeper level and create a reaction, but this simply feels gratuitous for no particular reason that serves the story. Mama is just not very important at all. This character arc is not long thereafter wrapped up when we get to abort the spectral fetus, which in turn causes Mama to die, concluding her entire story. And even when she dies, she is replaced by another character that looks exactly the same and does nothing for the rest of the game. Disposable is a word that comes to mind as we carry her wrapped up body in a bag up a mountain. Twice. She is ironically not alone though, and is only one of several other women who have to be carried in body bags to progress the story. And it is only women. Of course it is. So basically, they become literal objects inside of your inventory, essentially no different from the rest of those thousands of packages you carry on your regular routine. We are not saying that this means anything in particular, that Kojima and his team is a bunch of sexists, or that it is based on any underlying grudge against women. In fact, it doesn't even matter that much. We are mostly just saying that they maybe should have been more mindful about this, maybe read the room a bit more? Just like Quiet sharing the same space with a dog and a horse, women in body bags as inventory objects is just such a juicy goodness of unintentional objectification that it baffles the mind when you think about it. Especially in a game where you have brain-dead women as an underdeveloped flavor for world building. Mind you though, none of the things we have mentioned are necessarily the worst ideas on paper. You could have women in stories tackling these issues and make for something really interesting that speaks to experiences that some women face, like discrimination, abuse, fertility, childbirth, and motherhood. Death Stranding just doesn't execute these ideas particularly well, and mostly throws them out there without much thought or even care for what is being presented. It is dramatic, yes, but there should be more to it than that, right? We end up with rather basic and somewhat shallow roles for all these women to fill, and sometimes it just becomes straight up tasteless with underdeveloped concepts like the still mothers. Subjects that are too heavy for a bloated game with so much to say that it clearly can't handle them all with care. And that's another recurring theme, isn't it? That lost potential in speaking on too many matters, so you end up not saying anything at all. This idea of grandiosity, a great work that talks on all matters of the human condition. There's inevitably a lot that gets lost in the process when everything imaginable needs to be included. It's entirely likely that the portrayal of women in Death Stranding is just this, a casualty of half-baked ideas and clumsy execution. There is, however, also the possibility that Kojima Productions believed in this wholeheartedly. Comparing Metal Gear Solid 5 with Death Stranding on the surface may give you the impression that things have progressed quite far. At first glance, a character like Fragile is quiet done right, strong, capable, with actual clothes. Of course, it is a significant improvement. But is it enough? As we've talked about here, the difference in questionable portrayal has pivoted from external to internal. The problems are basically not as overt anymore, just obscure enough for some players to look back on the game with the impression that it filled the necessary quota. Both capable and relevant, the women of Death Stranding make up a large chunk of the cast as they remain on screen and fill important key roles. It all seems nice and fair if you don't think about it for 5 seconds. But behind that facade, there are all the same problems as before. It just seems like this time, they opted to hide it all in plain sight. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. We would like to thank the people who made this all possible.
K. Axwell, Sweet Pig, Mark Elliott, Joel Nilsson, Andrew Jones, Anonymous, Nate Kiernan, Ben Clark, Nishtstrat, Huang Wu, Tommy Håkansson, Athayet, Saifi, Clara Ros, Baba Kensi, Andreas, Arin Rain, Mattias Graman, That Jessica G, Chloe, Magnus, Silly Rookie, Biopanda, Roxy Jill, Starfighter, Morgan, Casey Explosion, Flynn Flamberge, Riley Rose Smith, Yantu, and Oscar Funes Galindo.
Wowie.
That's a lot of people, and if you like to join them, you can support us on Patreon.
Wow.
Where you can then join our Discord server, where there's a lot of fun stuff happening all the time.
And also we share a bunch of sneak peeks and stuff on the Patreon page, but especially on the Discord actually. So if you support us on Patreon, we share a bunch of silly things on the Patreon page and on the Discord. So it's kind of cool. It's kind of cool. It's where the cool people are. Really.
But we are there.
Fuck.